You may have been told, or you may believe, that Christianity has no place in science. In this video series, however, you have seen how Christianity has been intimately tied to science throughout history. You have also seen that the Judeo-Christian worldview was necessary for the rise of modern science, and that Christianity has been a major factor in moving science forward. Is that still true today? Does Christianity still play a part in science today? In this video, you will see that the answer is yes. And it may surprise you to know that one of the most theologically driven areas of science is evolution. Now, you may argue, as some have, that evolution has demonstrated that God is not necessary, and that Darwin came up with a purely scientific theory that was based on empirical evidence with no need for religion at all. If you think that, you'd be wrong. There is tremendous irony in the arguments for evolution. The theory that is supposedly the ultimate example of materialism and methodological or even philosophical naturalism, the theory that made God unnecessary, the theory that allowed Oxford zoologist Richard Dawkins to become an intellectually fulfilled atheist, is itself supported by arguments that contain premises about the nature of God. Evolution is a theological idea right from the beginning. Theological claims are rampant in Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Darwin's religion was prominent in his theory, and theological opinions are essential to his argument. Each tab represents a place where Darwin makes a theological argument. In chapter 14, his recapitulation and summary, he restates his theological arguments at least 10 times with statements like, "This is utterly inexplicable," or "this cannot be explained with the theory of special creation." This is a theological and a non-scientific assertion. Darwin's one long argument is based on the theological assumption that God would have never created the world like he did. Darwin's main theological claim is that the evidence he sees in the natural world contradicts the view that the species were independently and specifically created. And throughout the entire book, this is his dominant and repetitive argument. One example is that the species fall into a pattern that makes sense only if they arose from what were once varieties. But this makes no sense on the view of special creation. Quote, "These analogies are inexplicable if species are independent creations." A second example refers to the classification system of Linnaeus. Quote, "On the view that each species has been independently created, I can see no explanation of this great fact in the classification of organic beings." Quote, "This grand fact of the grouping of all organic beings seems to me utterly inexplicable on the theory of creation." Both of these examples are not science, but are instead theological assertions with no evidence provided. Darwin had a very specific view and expectation of God. His view was that God would be efficient in his creation in the very same way that we would be efficient. He assumed that our view of perfection was the same as God's view of perfection. He assumed that every organism would look exactly like we think it should look if it were perfectly adapted to its environment. Darwin says over and over again throughout the book that he cannot explain any of his observations with the view that species were independently created. Again, this is simply a theological assertion, making an assumption that he knows what God would do. Another example is Darwin's distress at the presence of bats on a remote island that doesn't have any other mammals on it. He seems to have a special knowledge of how God created and makes the claim that God would certainly not have done that. He had no evidence. It was simply an opinion about the nature of God. He is also troubled by the design of the skull. Quote, "How inexplicable are these facts on the ordinary view of creation? Why should the brain be enclosed in a box composed of such numerous and such extraordinarily shaped pieces of bone?" Again, another theological assertion, assuming he knows what God would have done. Evolutionary theory depends on the non-scientific theological assumptions of imperfection and homology. Imperfection arguments assume to know what designs are inconsistent with God's perfection and wisdom. The assumption is that if God created the universe, then we would observe perfect animals living in perfect harmony with the environment, at least what our idea of perfect is. One common example Darwin uses are the webbed feet of upland geese who rarely swim. Darwin claims that God could not have created what he views as a less than perfect design, and therefore these designs must have occurred through evolution. This reasoning is theological because it depends on our knowing what God could and should have done when creating. Now, these arguments were not just used by Darwin, and they are still being used today. One of the premises of the Darwinian paradigm is the suboptimality of organisms and structures. Biologist Stephen Jay Gould demonstrates this in his 1980 book, The Panda's Thumb. Quote, "Odd arrangements and funny solutions are the proof of evolution, paths that a sensible God would never tread, but that a natural process constrained by history follows perforce." Botanist Vern Grant, in his 1991 book, The Evolutionary Process, states there is no good explanation for the existence of rudimentary organs in the doctrine of creation. Richard Dawkins continues to repeat his assertions specifically against creation by referring to the assumed poor structure of the retina. Biologist Kenneth Miller, in his 1999 book, Finding Darwin's God, makes the assertion that God could not have created directly because of the high number of animals that have gone extinct. Miller's argument is that if God had created, he would have got it right the first time. Vestigial organs and non-functional organs and structures are still, today, automatically used as evidence for evolution. The vestigial organ argument is theological and not scientific. It is based on the supposed nature of the Creator. It should have no place in a scientific presentation of empirical facts and data. Evolutionary theory still hinges on a theological assumption about what a creator would and would not do. The homology argument assumes that patterns of resemblance are inconsistent with God's freedom to create. Therefore, if we see similarities among species, like the same designs used in the forearm of a human and in the wing of a bat, then this could not have been special creation, but instead must be evolution. This argument is also still being used today based on the false idea that there is one universal genetic code, and the special theological knowledge that God would not have created using only one genetic code. Mark Ridley, in his 1985 book, The Problems of Evolution, states that if different species had all been created separately, we should be very surprised if they had all been built with exactly the same genetic code. Biologist Douglas Futuyama makes the same argument. Contrary to how the theory is often portrayed, evolution was not developed solely using the traditional objective scientific method. Ironically, the theory most often used to promote scientism and naturalism is itself evidence against scientism and naturalism. Alex Rosenberg and other atheists claim that pure science, scientism, is the only way to know anything, and that theology can't tell you anything that you can trust. It is inconsistent to insist that religion, Christianity, or even intelligent design doesn't belong in the scientific arena, while at the same time appealing to a theological argument. If a religious argument is to be made, then the opinions of creationists and theologians should be considered. If scientists are going to insist that creationism and intelligent design have no place in science because they aren't testable, then what are Darwin and many evolutionary biologists doing today, emphasizing a theological argument about the imperfection of nature and the nature of how God would create? Now, I have made no claims in this video, purposely, about whether evolutionary theory is correct. The main point is that theology has always been a part of science and has been the main driving force for scientific inquiry. Darwin, on the other hand, used theology as a negative argument, something that has continued to this day. Theology has continued to play a crucial role in evolutionary theory, and this history demonstrates the crucial and complex relationship between religion and science. It also demonstrates that Christianity is still a major driving force in science.